Wireless LAN Weekly, Episode 29, 802.11n with Joe Bardwell and Ron Nutter.
Welcome to Wireless LAN Weekly, a podcast focused on the wireless networking professional. We aim to educate, inform, entertain, and inspire. Get ready to listen and enjoy. Now to our host of the show, Keith Parsons.
Welcome to Wireless LAN Weekly. This is episode number 29. This week, I have brought back Ron Nutter. Ron Nutter runs a show called TechBytes, and Ron Nutter has some interviews with Joe Bardwell. Joe Bardwell's from Connect 802, and they'll be talking about 802.11n. I'm kind of out of the loop this week. I happen to be on vacation, but I pre-recorded this so we could still get our weekly podcast out to you. I'm enjoying myself with the family this week, so please enjoy this presentation from Ron Nutter and Joe Bardwell on 802.11n. Now on with the show.
Interesting facts, little-known tidbits, things you might not have known, short little bits to set your mind a-reeling.
If you have 9 clients for every AP, did you know that 90% of your problems will be caused by your clients? That's a 9-to-1 ratio, 90%. Look at how many clients you have per AP, calculate it up, and find out that's where you need to be putting your effort. It's always going to be on the client side. Look to your clients.
Things every wireless LAN professional needs to know. Gear up, buckle down, and stand by for the real techie stuff.
And welcome to another edition of TechBytes with Ron Nutter. Joining me today is Joe Bardwell, President and Chief Scientist with Connect 802. And Joe, we've had something happen in the past few weeks that I think some of us weren't expecting for a while yet, and that was 802.11n finally got ratified.
Indeed, after so long a time.
Yeah, help us understand. There's quite a bit coming to us with 802.11. What makes it faster, and kind of give us a brief overview of the changes we're looking at to get to that theoretical maximum 600 megabit transfer rate.
Sure, and you know, 802.11n draft 2, which is what has been shipping for a year and a half, which is completely compatible with the final draft standard, provided data rates up to 300 megabits per second. I think the first thing is it's important to note that 802.11n, when we talk about 300 megabits per second, you get about 75% of that in TCP/IP throughput. So a 300 megabit per second N connection gives you just over 200 megabits per second of actual TCP/IP throughput. And that compares with 802.11b, G, and A, where you only got about 50% of actual throughput. So an 802.11g or A connection at 54 megabits per second, you got about 22 megabits per second. So 802.11n, there are some fundamental changes in the technology, the way that the signal is transmitted, the way that errors are corrected, the rules for taking turns transmitting data that bring the data rate up to about 72.2 megabits per second is the first step up, because of fundamental changes in the technology, the way there's the orthogonal frequency division multiplexing, the OFDM symbol is modified, and error correction is added, and the guard interval between symbols is shortened. So you get 72.2 megabits per second out of the box, and that translates to around 50 megabits per second of TCP/IP throughput. Then you have the option of configuring for a double-wide channel. Instead of a 20 megahertz channel, which is what's used in 802.11b, G, and A, you can use a 40 megahertz channel, and that brings us up to 150 megabits per second. It's a little bit better than double because of the fact that the double-wide channel also embraces the space that would have existed between the two adjacent channels. The thing to remember on 40 megahertz channels is that in 2.4 gigahertz, you only get one. There's not enough room to put two 40 megahertz channels in the 11 channel space. So for home use or for an application where there's only one access point required, then 40 megahertz channels in 2.4 gigahertz gives you 150 megabits per second. That's a beautiful thing. But for a commercial implementation where you have to develop a channel plan for multiple access points, you have to move to 5.8 gigahertz, where you have a sufficient number of channels to give you 40 megahertz channels and let you develop a non-overlapping channel plan. Then there's MIMO, multiple input, multiple output, where through very clever engineering, the receiving access point or the receiving device is able to differentiate between signals that were transmitted, and some of them bounced off the wall on the left, some of them bounced off the wall on the right, and the transmitter and receiver recognize that they can separate the two reflected groups of signals, and they are separated based on the fact that one's on one side of the room, one's on the other side of the room. It's called spatial multiplexing, because two separate streams take two different reflective paths to the receiver. And spatial multiplexing, multiple input, multiple output, this MIMO stuff, is a statistical probability. You may be able to acquire two spatial streams, and the person sitting next to you might not be able to acquire two spatial streams until they nudge their notebook computer over 2 or 3 inches, and then, lo and behold, the statistics all line up and they get multiple spatial streams. So that's what takes us up to 300 megabits per second. We got to 150 megabits per second with 40 megahertz channels. And then if I am using, if I get two spatial streams, it takes me to 300 megabits per second. Going forward, we will see that over the years, in the next few years, equipment will add additional radios, and that means additional antennas to get us 3 spatial streams, which is 450 megabits per second, or 4 spatial streams, which is 600 megabits per second. So today, and for the immediate future, the expectation is that the capabilities that we saw in Draft 2 of the 802.11n standard with regard to spatial streams, 1 and 2 spatial streams, 300 megabit per second connectivity, that's pretty much where we are right now. It will take the hardware manufacturers time to ramp up and give us equipment that could support more than that.
Oh, well, if there's enough money, I'm sure they can manage to do just about anything.
Indeed.
Well, Joe, thank you for stopping by for a few minutes today to kind of give us a quick brief on what we're looking at with 802.11n.
Great. My pleasure.
This is Ron Nutter. Welcome to another edition of TechBytes. We've got Joe Bardwell joining us again today. And Joe, with the last time we had you on, and we were talking kind of a general overview of 802.11n, there's something called OFDM. And, okay, please explain that term and what it means. And then you said there's some modifications that are helping improve the speeds we're going to see with 802.11.
Sure, Ron. So OFDM, it stands for Orthogonal Frequency Division Multiplexing, and it refers to the structure of the signal that is transmitted to represent bits in many wireless technologies, including 802.11g and A and 802.11n. And OFDM transmission involves taking the bit stream, the data stream, and breaking it up into multiple parallel bit streams, and then transmitting each of those bit streams in a separate, very narrow channel with all those narrow band channels stacked up next to each other as a single transmission. And what this does is it allows the receiver to be less influenced by noise. So the engineering advantage of OFDM is it provides a better signal-to-noise ratio than simply transmitting bits using a single stream of bits transmitted with a single type of modulation. So OFDM, as it is implemented in 802.11g and 802.11a, breaks the bit stream up into 48 parallel subcarriers, and in one electromagnetic burst, that OFDM symbol is transmitted out, and the 48 adjacent subcarriers each carry their own bit data, and the receiver gets it and recovers the bits from the air. With 802.11n, OFDM is modified so that instead of 48 parallel subcarriers, there are now 52. And that takes the data stream from 54 megabits per second, as we would see in 802.11g or 802.11a, up to 58.5 megabits per second. And that is then improved to 65 megabits per second by additional error correction, and that's improved up to 72.2 megabits per second by shortening the gap between OFDM symbols, and that can be doubled to 150 megabits per second with wider channels, which can be doubled to 300 megabits per second with multiple spatial streams with MIMO in 802.11n. So the modifications to OFDM, the increasing the number of subcarriers, speaks to the fact that in order to accomplish this, the radio circuitry that is designed and manufactured for an 802.11n access point is a more sophisticated piece of electronics. And where this comes into play is when you implement an 802.11n capable access point. Let's say you're evolving from an 802.11bg environment to 802.11n, and your plan is to implement 802.11n in 5.8 gigahertz, leaving 802.11bg backwards compatible. You get a dual radio access point. And the fact that the access point implements circuitry that is 802.11n capable, you find that even the backwards compatible 2.4 gigahertz BG capabilities are improved. that the data rates go up. Somebody that might only be able to connect at 6 megabit per second G, now they're connecting at 18 megabits per second perhaps. The perceived range improves. So in the same way that in order to increase the number of subcarriers in OFDM to increase the basic data rate for 802.11n, that required more sophisticated hardware, the advantages of that hardware roll over into all of the transmit and receive capabilities of an 802.11n capable access point.
Well, that ought to make it challenging for a few people, because the ones who really get under the hood are going to go, okay, now let's see, this changed here to how this means I have to start changing this configuration out. That'll give people a few nights worth of reading to go over some of this to get a firm grip on it.
Well, you're absolutely right. And in fact, going along with that, one of the things, when you look at a BG or A access point, you always see a spec sheet perhaps that shows a particular dB milliwatt signal level that is associated with a particular connection rate that may be at minus 72 dB milliwatts. You get 54 megabit per second connectivity. But 802.11n uses a specification called the Modulation Coding Scheme, or MCS Index. And it's a number that we'll see from 1 to 15, and it will say that MCS Index 7 requires a signal-to-noise ratio of 18 dB and a power level of minus 75 dB milliwatts, whatever. And you go out and Google on Modulation Coding Scheme or MCS Index, and you get a copy of the table. And what the table will say is that for a particular MCS index, there is a particular coding scheme, OFDM, there's BPSK, binary phase shift keying, and QPSK, quadrilateral phase shift keying. And there's different coding schemes in addition to OFDM, a particular channel width, a particular guard interval. So this single number, the MCS index, is used to convey a whole group of what's under the hood in terms of a given transmission. So while we talk about 300 megabit per second 11N or 150 megabit per second, when you look at actual product data sheets, you see references to the MCS index. So you should go out and download a copy of the MCS index table, and that's what'll keep you up late at night.
Especially figuring out who's got the best lie.
That's when 3 marketing people and 1 engineer go out and drink beer, and they come back with the data sheet.
Oh, jeez. But well, Joe, thank you for giving us a little more Oh, okay. Sorry, I had something going on there that I didn't think I had running. Giving us a little more information on 802.11n and, some things that we've got to start thinking about as we deploy it. And folks, if you haven't looked at Joe's website, if you go to www.connect802.com, and there are some very good tutorials and reference information that I think will probably break down some of the more technical things for you to where us normal folks can understand it.
You're right, Ron. In fact, you'll find on the homepage there's a big button for 802.11n tutorial that explains all of this in some good detail.
Okay, well, good enough. Thank you for your time, Joe.
Okay, bye-bye.
And welcome to another edition of TechBytes. This is Ron Nutter, and joining me today is Joe Bardwell, continuing the series we're doing on 802.11n. And today, Joe, we're going to talk about some differences in 802.11n in terms of how the frame aggregation, forward error correction, and the shorter guard interval are all helping improve the speed on 802.11.
Well, Ron, and you're right. In fact, that's a short list of things that are under the hood. We talk about the big picture items of MIMO with multiple spatial streams. Talk about 40 megahertz channels, but the fundamental 802.11 protocol, the fundamental technology, has also been changed and improved to include things that allow the basic overhead to be decreased. In 802.11 BG and A, almost 50% of the connection rate was overhead. So 54 megabit per second 802.11g connection gave you about 20, 22, 23 megabits per second of TCP/IP throughput, whereas in 802.11n, almost 75% of the connection rate is actual TCP/IP throughput, and it's better for UDP because there's no TCP acknowledgments. So one of the things that improves this is a capability called frame aggregation. And frame aggregation allows the transmitter and receiver to agree on a mechanism whereby multiple frames can be sent back to back with a single acknowledgement for the multiple data blocks. So that instead of sending data and then there's an 802.11 acknowledgement, then data acknowledgement, if I have multiple frames to send to a destination, I can put them back to back and send them all in one larger data block. And that's a tremendous enhancement for TCP/IP, because if we think about the way the TCP/IP protocol works by sending sequential segments of data until the receiver's TCP window is full, I may send as a TCP, at layer 4 in the stack, I may send 3 or 4 or 5 TCP frames and then wait for a TCP acknowledgement. Well, with frame aggregation, those 3 or 4 TCP frames could all be aggregated into a single 802.11 frame and sent with a single 802.11 acknowledgement. You'll find if you read about, you do some homework on frame aggregation, there are a lot of implementation-specific details. There's an aggregation mechanism where the data blocks are aggregated together into a single 802.11 frame, and there's another mechanism where entire frames are aggregated together. And they talk about this as the service data unit aggregation, or MSDU, the MAC service data unit aggregation, MSDU, or the protocol data unit aggregation. And the details are, it's an intellectual curiosity, but fundamentally when frame aggregation is used, it means that the transmitter can transmit a block of frames with a single 802.11 acknowledgement and a single checksum calculation being performed at the end. And in addition to frame aggregation, there are changes in the way that error correction is performed, the parity check and frame check sequence, adjustments in the way that the rate changing. We talk about, you look at 802.11g, 802.11a, and I have 54 megabits per second, but if there's noise, I might drop back to 36 megabits per second, and if there's more noise, I might drop back to 12 megabits per second. That mechanism for dynamic rate adjustment is enhanced in 802.11 so that there is a better probability of getting a maximum data rate. And there are other pieces, interframe spacing. There's a technology aspect called space-time block coding, STBC, which is a feature that comes into play with voice over IP. So under the hood, 802.11 builds in a number of sophisticated features, which by the way, that means that the electronic circuitry that implements the radio equipment in an 11N access point is a more sophisticated piece of electronics, so that an 802.11n radio, even if it's being used for backwards compatible B, G, or A, is a better functioning piece of electronic radio equipment.
And then the vendors can charge you more.
Well, and it's true that there's no question that with every manufacturer, the corresponding 802.11n equipment is more expensive than what would be the ABG equipment. So you get an ABG access point versus the ABG-N version. N is always going to be more expensive. But over the lifetime of any installed network, you put a network, you hang that stuff up on the walls today. Over the 3, 5, or 8 years that's going to be up on the walls, it will be called on to support 802.11n. So when budgets can justify it, put in N today. Don't wait. You spend your money now, or you spend your money later.
This is true, and it's it may get cheaper in time, but how long do you want to wait before you start getting the gear in and getting some advantage of some better speed?
That's right, because when you're looking at ROI, you have to say, I'm going to have people going around bolting this stuff up on the walls, and if 2-3 years from now I have to send them around and have it come off the walls and put new equipment up, the delta is not just maybe 802.11n equipment will be reduced in cost, but there's also the fixed cost of having somebody do that component of the installation. And if you have to go back in 2 or 3 years to upgrade to 11N, you're doubling that specific piece of the installation. Obviously not necessarily the cabling, although 11N, you need to have an infrastructure that in general, you need to have an infrastructure that supports gigabit Ethernet. Because if we're saying I'm going to put a 300 or 450 or 600 megabit per second capacity radio up on the wall, well, I need gig E support in the background, the Cat 6 or whatever wiring. I need gig switches in the wiring closets, which means I might need 10 gig fiber between the wiring closets. Who knows? It's got to be drawn out on paper to determine what that level of support is going to be.
True, and if you're looking at using some of the access points that are fed with power over Ethernet, I know the earlier version of one of the Cisco access points that had the full spatial support and all that, you had to eat up 2 Ethernet ports on the switch because it took 2 ports of PoE to actually feed it to where it would come up and run.
That's right, and although the broad sweep of the brush, most access points will now run with standard 802.3 AF, 15-watt power supply. We're seeing the confluence of the new 802.3 AT high power PoE coming into play, plus vendors in many cases will run 802.11n with standard 802.3 AF. But we still see that there are access points that come with their own proprietary PoE injectors because they need more power than an AF injector or AF switch will provide.
Gotta love it. It's always, they got the solution if you got the money. So
that's right.
Well, Joe, thank you for your time and giving us some more insight on the improvements with 802.11n.
My pleasure.
And welcome to another edition of Tech Bytes with Ron Nutter. And today we have Joe Bardwell in our continuing series over the 802.11n announcements that have been coming out recently. And Joe, this is one I think that's going to have a lot of people excited, and that's now we can have a 40 megahertz channel when using 802.11n, which really ought to help with some of the speed transfers that some people just want to have everything now, but they want to do it wireless.
Indeed. And of course, the 40 megahertz versus the conventional 20 megahertz channel, very simply, it doubles the capacity of the channel. So if you had a 60, 70 megabit per second connection, it now becomes 130, 150 megabit per second. It doubles the capacity of the channel. So when we talk about 150 megabit per second connectivity with 11N, one way to achieve that is with a 40 megahertz channel. So the benefit, and channel width is a manual configuration. You select it. You want 40 megahertz channels, you check the checkbox, the radio button in the configuration of the access point, and you use 40 megahertz channels. The gotcha is that when you're thinking about 2.4 gigahertz, where we're running 802.11b and G today, versus 5.8 gigahertz, where we're running 802.11a today, in the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum, there's only 83.5 megahertz of total spectrum available in North America. In the band as a whole, less in North America, where we're using channels 1 through 11. And what you find is that if you try to use a 40 megahertz channel in the 2.4 gigahertz space, only one 40 megahertz channel will fit. You know, we talk about the three non-overlapping channels, 1, 6, and 11. Those are three non-overlapping 20 megahertz channels. Well, there's only one 40 megahertz channel. You couldn't put a second one in that space. So to get the benefit of double-wide 40 megahertz channels in 2.4 gigahertz, you get one channel. And that's fine if you only have one access point, which would be the case in a home. It would be the case in a small commercial environment where I'm only covering 1,500, 2,500 square feet, maybe up to 3,000 square feet, where I have a single access point and I don't have to build a channel plan. But when I'm creating an enterprise network and I'm having multiple access points because I need the capacity or the user density demands it, and I have to create a channel plan with effectively minimize the overlap between channels, I have to go to 5.8 gigahertz. 5.8 gigahertz, and it's an interesting history that's beyond what we could talk about in a couple minutes, but nonetheless, where 2.4 gigahertz falls under the ISM rules, Industrial, Scientific, and Medical band, the ISM band. In the 5 gigahertz band, it falls under the regulations for the Unlicensed National Information Infrastructure, the UNII, the Unlicensed National Information Infrastructure rules. And those rules break the 5 gigahertz band up into a low, middle, and high range. And the low range, which has 4 20 megahertz channels in it, is power limited to 40 milliwatts and is designed for indoor use. The high range, which has 800 milliwatt maximum power limitation, also has 4 channels and is intended for outdoor use. The middle range, there's that itself, the mid-range is broken up, UNII 2 is broken up into 2 groups. There's UNII 2 has 4 channels that are standard, and then there are an additional 8 channels that are the extended UNII 2 band. So, and UNII 2 is either indoor or outdoor and provides up to 200 milliwatt power output limitation. The thing about UNII 2 is this, because military radar and airport radar operates licensed transmissions in the UNII 2 band, any unlicensed transmitter operating in UNII 2 is required to support what's called radar avoidance, which means that an 802.11n access point operating with UNII 2 support needs to detect detect the presence of radar signals and automatically shift off of the channels that are being used by the military or airport radar. As a result, some manufacturers have taken the approach of saying, well, instead of adding that complexity to our 802.11n 5 gigahertz access point, let's simply ignore support for Uni 2. So in that case, you would have 4 20 megahertz channels in Uni 1 and 4 in Uni 3. If that were the case and you were doing an indoor implementation, you would have 2 available 40 megahertz channels out of the original 4 20 megahertz channels in Uni 1. So you definitely want Uni 2 support. That gives us 8 20 megahertz channels available for indoor use, which divides out to 4 40 megahertz channels that can be used to build a non-overlapping channel plan. So 40 megahertz channels introduces an additional design aspect and an additional set of considerations when selecting 802.11n 5 gigahertz equipment.
Just one more thing you have to go look at before you sign on the dotted line to take that next set of gear and start putting in. It's not something you just want to just pick up and run with. There's really going to be a lot more planning and thinking things through that you're going to have to do as you move into N.
Absolutely. It's, you get the marketing people go out and drink beer with a couple of engineers and come back with a glowing data sheet of all the capabilities, but the laws of physics are such that there's always trade-offs. And the design considerations for 802.11n, it's possible to throw that equipment up on the wall and not see all of the enhanced performance capabilities that you expect from what you hear about when you read, all of the things that 11n can do.
Or if you have my luck, you won't see any of the improvements if it works right for you. So that's just the way it's going to happen. Well, Joe, appreciate the time you spent with us today, because this is one of the features I think it's going to get a lot of people's attention, but there's going to be a little more planning that has to occur before you can just, turn it on and let the users have at it.
Indeed.
All right. Well, thank you much, Joe.
My pleasure.
And welcome to another edition of TechBytes with Ron Nutter. And joining me today for the last in the series that we've been working on 802.11n is Joe Bardwell, President and Chief Scientist of Connect 802. And before we get started, Joe, for those of you who have not been listening to some of the other segments or heard those yet, please go to the website, www.connect802.com, for some very good information on implementing N, on some of the technology you're going to be dealing with, because it'll be well served on getting you a very successful implementation of it. Now, Joe, one of the things they're going to talk about today is MIMO or MIMO, however you want to pronounce it, and something called spatial multiplexing that's also involved in improving the 802.11 speeds.
Indeed. So, and MIMO, multiple input, multiple output, is always the first one of the very first things you hear about what's cool about 802.11n. In fact, it's the last piece of the puzzle. After all of the other speed enhancements that are part of 802.11n come into play, we're at the point where perhaps we have 150 megabit per second channel with a 40 megahertz wide, with all the other things kicked in, 150 megabit per second channel. And from there, it may be possible for a given transmitter and a given receiver in a given environment to implement, to realize this capability of multiple spatial streams or multiple input, multiple output. Here's how it works. If we think about a single transmitting antenna, and we think about the electromagnetic signal flowing out, going out from that antenna in basically in all directions, some better than others, but it's going out in all directions. And we think that some signal goes out and hits the wall on the left side of the room, and then it hits the file cabinet, and it reflects and goes to the receiving antenna. And some signal goes directly from the transmitting antenna to the receiving antenna. And what we see is that the two signal paths, one, the result of reflections in the environment, and the other, the direct signal path, those two signal paths are of different lengths, because of course the direct ray went direct and the reflected ray bounced off something, so it was a little bit longer. And in fact, by implementing very clever mathematics in the way that the signal is transmitted, it is possible to differentiate between signal that came directly from the transmitter to the receiver and signal that took a reflective path from transmitter to receiver. And if that's possible, I could have two transmitting antennas transmitting on the same frequency in the same channel at the same time, and some of the signal from those antennas would go directly to a pair of antennas on the receiver, and some would take the reflected path. And if I transmit one data stream that I know is going to go the direct path, and I transmit a second data stream that I know is going to take the reflected path, I transmit two data streams at the same time. I have multiple input data streams into the air, and the receiver is able to pull multiple streams out of the air, and those two streams are differentiated by their location in space, hence spatial multiplexing. If I can do that, then I double the data rate, and I go from 150 to 300 megabits per second with two spatial streams, 300 to 450 with three spatial streams, coming soon to a access point near you, and 600 megabits per second with four spatial streams. So multiple spatial streams, it is a statistical probability. There is a chance that the placement of the transmitter relative to the placement of the receiver, in considering the reflective nature of a given environment, it may be the case that I am able to differentiate between the direct ray and a reflected ray. And what that says is there's very sophisticated electronics and software in an 802.11n device that gives the 802.11n transmitter and receiver a knowledge of what the channel is going to look like. And because the transmitter and receiver, there's a transmission of a thing called a training symbol, and in the preamble of the data packet there is a foreknowledge of whether or not transmitter and receiver are positioned such that the perfect storm, the statistical probability is realized, and I can transmit two spatial streams, or three, or four. And so spatial multiplexing, the ability to transmit a direct ray and a reflected ray at the same time, so I have multiple input and the receiver has multiple outputs from the air, doubles the data rate. And that's MIMO. And that's why we see an access point that looks like a porcupine, because it's got antennas for 5 gigahertz, antennas for 2.4 gigahertz, and when you see one that has 3 antennas for 11N, it's taking the best 2 out of 3, almost like the old diversity antennas. So we have specifications 2x3 or 3x3 MIMO. How many antennas are used for transmission? How many are used for receive? And we will see that as hardware evolves, now that the 802.11n standards have been finalized, that hardware will come out over the next year or two that will support 3 or 4 spatial streams. And of course, at the end of the day, it's the lowest common denominator. If you have a notebook computer with 2 little patch antennas on the circuit board for built-in 802.11n, or you have two antennas that are inside the screen of a notebook computer, if you only have 2 antennas, you only get 2 spatial streams maximum, because you do need a separate piece of radio circuitry and a separate antenna for each spatial stream.
And it's just something that, it's going to be an adjustment that everybody's going to have to go through. And for those companies that have the folks that has to look just right, they may kind of have to be a little flexible, because some of these new APs may be a little ugly from their perception because of all those extra antennas. And
that's right. And the other thing, Ron, and I know we don't have a lot of time. We could spend a lot of time talking about this, but the fundamental design paradigm for 802.11n is different than that for BG or A. If you had a conference room and you wanted to support 30 people in the conference room, and you were going to put an 802.11g access point in the conference room, what we have learned over the years is, hey, I'll stick the access point in the middle of the room on the ceiling, and that'll be the best thing. And that's not an unreasonable thing to think. However, with 802.11n, I don't want the access point in the middle of the room. I want it off in the corner of the room or even outside the room, because I want to maximize the scattering of the RF signal to improve the probability of achieving multiple spatial streams for those 30 people in the room. So where 802.11b, G, and N suffers from multipath distortion, the fact that reflections cause canceling signals for the receiver, 802.11n benefits from a rich multipath environment with lots of reflections and lots of scattering, because it improves the chances of recovering a second spatial stream.
Well, like I said, it's just going to take some learning and some time, and and if you've got the chance before you have to go live with it, get some of the gear and work within the lab and start understanding how it's just going to be, a little bit different in some cases.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, Joe, we've come to the end of our time. I really appreciate all the time you spent with us for the past few episodes, getting us up to speed on at least getting a running start with what we're looking at on 802.11n. And folks, please go to his website, www.connect802.com, for some very good information that will only help your learning of us. And I'm sure if you get into a large implementation, Joe, you'll be glad to help them with their problem, won't you?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you much for your time, Joe.
Right, Ron, thank you.
Rant, pet peeve, what really bugs you? 60 seconds of complaining starts now.
Today's rant is on 2.4 gigahertz spectrum. Simply put, 2.4 gig is overrated. It's overused. It's oversaturated. It's plain over. Look to 5 gig for your solutions. We'd like to thank Ron Nutter and Joe Bardwell for their time helping with the podcast. Glad that Ron could take the role there of guest host, and the guest in this case was Joe Bardwell. So thanks to them for that, and thanks for listening to the show today. We again look forward to your feedback and ideas on what you'd like to hear on Wireless LAN Weekly. Feel free to go on the website, look at the resources that are available to you there, and if you'd like to subscribe, we'll start sending out newsletters in September. So sign up for the newsletter and you'll be able to get a newsletter in your email box probably about once a month or so. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk with you next week.
Wireless LAN Weekly, a podcast focused on the needs of wireless LAN professionals. We look forward to your feedback. Please leave your comments at the bottom of the show notes, or email feedback on the show can be sent to feedback@wirelesslanprofessionals.com. If you'd like to leave a voicemail feedback, just call 24/7 and leave a message at 1-801-481-9018. Until next time, this has been another production of wirelesslanprofessionals.com, a place to educate, inform, entertain, and inspire.